What we'd like to do now is take that kind of big global picture down, and we'd like to bring it down to local. And we've a really good investment panel here with us today. So I'm going to hand over to our investors and to Niamh Sterling, who's going to take us through that. So Niamh and panel, thank you so much.
Thank you, Conor. And thank you, Sean. Incredible to hear the details of Sean's stories, key moments, his sort of sense his passion for what he does and his plans for the future. We were as wrapped here in the studio as I'm sure you were at home. And I'm delighted to be joined by my panel of guests and experts now to dig into some of those themes from an Irish perspective. I'm joined by Niall McEvoy, Enterprise Ireland HPSU Manager in the ICT, Richard Watson from DBIC Ventures, Faye Walsh, Drouillard is joining us from WakeUp Capital, and Chris Burge from Spark Crowdfunding. So thank you so much for joining me here today. Richard, can I start with you? There seems to be kind of changes afoot in the investing world. We're seeing an increasing number of micro VCs, increasing professionalization of the angel networks, and larger funds investing earlier through their scouting funds. So I'm wondering how you see these changes impacting on the Irish investment landscape.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in terms of micro VCs, there's a definite trend in the US. We're seeing a lot of sort of funds investing smaller amounts at sort of seed to pre-seed to seed stage. In the context of the Irish market, I think what we're really seeing is we're seeing a lot of international funds. There's a lot of liquidity in the markets, both public and private. And we're seeing a lot of international VCs coming in and scouting for deal flow in Ireland. So coming in and looking for Series A opportunities and beyond. I'd say a lot of the audience, not all, but are probably at seed stage, and our fund is focused at that stage. There aren't that many seed funds in Ireland, so there is a limited supply of institutional seed capital. We're very active in the market. What I'd say is, HBAN definitely, the various angel syndicates becoming much more professional in their approach, operating very much like VCs. And we're seeing individual angels generally writing smaller checks, but doing more deals.
And
so
more
the average
complex
amount,
deals.
Which?
The deals are more complex.
More complex deals, exactly. So, there is that limited supply of capital. Not every company obviously gets funded at seed stage. But then if you're performing well, we're seeing international VCs looking in and coming in, the Sequoias of this world, Index Ventures and so forth, coming in and investing more at Series A stage than we would have seen sort of, 5-10 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And Faye, Sean has discussed some of the big themes of sustainability, health, and how they comprise the greatest economic opportunity ever. Is there an opportunity for Irish entrepreneurs and investors to carve out a competitive niche across these themes? Which themes do you think, I suppose, do we have a natural advantage for over other geographies, and why might that be?
Absolutely. And I actually feel like Sean covered so many of the topics that does tie into what I'd like to share today, and thanks for having me on the panel. I think definitely the combination of the research, grant capital available, universities heavily involved, government support, there's a great place for startups in Ireland, and already sets a really good framework to focus on these areas. However, a lot of the attention is traditionally, at least in the last 10, 20 years, has been focused on software and, seeking, as I always say, seeking the next stripe, but also in medtech and biotech. And I think the areas where there's a really great opportunity within Ireland is within food innovation. So, for example, ingredients for humans and animals. Also, sort of agriculture, obviously, as a part of Ireland heritage, but really hasn't innovated in the way that it probably needs to be more sustainable. And it's required, really, if we're going to feed the world's population in the next century. So out of that could be some sort of smart technology for managing the herd, for example. And then also food packaging. I think that's another area where Ireland could focus on and has the potential for. And then within the renewable energy space, I know Sean mentioned Ireland's really good at that. I think actually we still have a ways to go here. It was kind of him to say. I think obviously offshore wind is getting a bigger boost, but I think technologies that could make offshore wind even more efficient and effective. Also, we're going to need to retrofit a whole bunch of structures and buildings across the entire island of Ireland. Could this be a time and a place to innovate on those kind of technologies? For example, could we see the next Nest come out of Ireland, for water, for example. And then also, I think EV and light mobility infrastructure, I know that's being done in droves elsewhere. But again, Ireland's such a great testbed market. Is this a place or space where we could take all those learnings and focus it in on those other technologies? And then circular economy, waste management, Biofuel, even though that requires significant CapEx expenditure, even just working on the research and development around those ideas for further commercialization. And then lastly, I know you asked about health. And again, Ireland has a great history of working in medtech and biotech, building widgets that go help save lives. But I think here we could focus on digital wellness solutions, remote diagnostics. I know Sean mentioned wearables and the Internet of Things, and being able to actually interpret that data to help with preventative healthcare. And then lastly, an area that you all know I'm very passionate about is femtech, and basically products designed by and for women, because we just need more diversity in innovation, but also on the investor side. So hopefully that gives an overview of some of the opportunities I see here in Ireland.
Fantastic, Faye. And Niall, just turning to you and taking up from that, you see everything that grows and scales in Ireland, really, across all of those sectors that Faye mentioned. So what changes are in investment have made an impact in supporting growth of these companies? And what needs to evolve and change further to continue to enable VCs and angels to capitalise on this new wave of investment?
Yeah, I mean, interesting point by Richard earlier on about, the nature of the investment market in Ireland, okay, in terms of seed stage versus growth stage. I mean, one of the things we've seen over the course of the pandemic certainly is the leveling of the playing field to some extent in terms of being able to access international capital. So there's a very vibrant local and domestic pre-seed and seed stage market. But we've actually seen we've seen plenty of companies within our portfolio have actually got pre-seed internationally and have got seed internationally. Now, some of that is a factor of definitely access to international capital through the pandemic, because people got more into being able to take remote meetings, and it became the norm. You suddenly found yourself being able to have those conversations. And we've also seen, as Richard said, we've seen the emergence of large international players within the growth funding scene, and it's really, really key, and we're delighted to see it. I mean, Enterprise Ireland is the largest funder in this market, not just the funder of companies ourselves, but the funder of funds as well.
Absolutely.
But competition is good in the market, and the more international companies, the more international investors that come sniffing around Ireland for deals because they believe there's good value, they believe there's great early stage technology businesses, they believe in the global outlook and the framework that is there to support these companies. So the likes of Accel and Index and Blossom and Tiger Global and Summit Partners and One Peak. They're just some names that I was looking up earlier and say, well, actually, what deals have we been involved in with big international deals? So there's definitely things have changed and moved. And in terms of what needs to change and what might change. I mean, there's the source of the capital, but there's also what the capital is doing.
Yeah.
And I'm a firm believer in the network effect that good investors can bring to the table.
Yeah.
And if I look at investors, and I've been involved probably in hundreds of deals in recent years through my role in Enterprise Ireland, but the one thing that disappoints me a lot is the impact of the network of investors. And I think some of that's partly down to the investors, but I also, without wishing to tar all investors with the lazy investor brush, right? Okay. But some of them, it's easy to hunt down the deal and be chase, got to get this deal done. Yeah. But then the deal's done, you're moving on to your next deal. But actually you've got to drive value into your engagement with the client. So, and I think entrepreneurs have a responsibility and a role to play there as well. As an entrepreneur and as a promoter in the business, you need to challenge your investors to make an impact in the areas that you're looking to do business.
Doors.
Oh yeah. I mean, never have a conversation with your investor, whether that's Enterprise Ireland, whether that's Faye, whether it's one of the guys here today, or whether it's one of the international investors that we all come across. Challenge them to add value to their investment. If you're not asking them to do something every time you engage with them, you're not getting the best value out of them.
Leave the meeting with an ask.
100%, every time.
And Chris, just thinking in terms of these impact-driven companies, do you think they suit crowdfunding really well? And is there growing appetite amongst retail investors to invest in enterprises such as social and climate change solutions?
Yeah, absolutely. There is. We have numbers of focus groups throughout and we poll our investor base about these things, and they're very interested in doing so. In fact, we've actually got one on the platform right at the moment. It's obviously the impact investment covers a whole range of things, whether that be the climate change or the sustainability, but it's also about disadvantaged groups and people within that as well. And so Access Earth, who are on the platform at the moment, are helping to do that. They are opening up accessibility for the disabled community, and that's one of the things that they are doing. But more so than that, we've just rolled out last year we rolled out a competition, a university competition, which opened up a competition for students at third level institutions to try crowdfunding, to develop their business and their entrepreneurial skills, and that was a very successful. We had 80 competitors. We had 4,000 student investors, and we've just rolled it out into the UK as well now. So that opens up the ability for other people to kind of look at the democratization of investment and open it up to other people who might want to actually come into it.
Yeah, and people who are passionate about the causes that are launching technologies or solutions on those platforms, right?
Absolutely.
Richard, just looking at the increase of investment, there was a reported 280% increase of investment in technologies that are addressing these vital issues such as climate change and social equality. So how does that impact your investment selection process?
Firstly, we're not an impact fund, but that's not to say that we don't make investments that have impact. So, if you talk about the different sectors and impact, I'll talk about healthcare, which is really where we're seeing most of the activity in Ireland. If you look at sort of clean tech, renewable energy, we actually saw more. Ironically, several years ago, we did quite a few investments in the EV and energy storage space there. And then ag tech, we're seeing some deal flow in that space. And then ed tech, but it's not really impact because it's kind of white collar professional workers. It doesn't cover the UN sustainability goals. But going back to healthcare, that is one of the biggest areas we're seeing deal flow in. So in the area of med tech, we're seeing a lot of really good startups coming through the BioInnovate program, going through commercialization within universities funded by EI, and then spinning out. And we've got 4 investments in that space on the go. And also in digital health, we're seeing some good digital health opportunities. Like in our previous fund, we invested in a company called Silver Cloud Health, which is there to help roll out mental health services to people with depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues. And that's now being used by the NHS and was acquired. So we want to see the next generation of those types of companies coming through, and we are seeing some really good opportunities in the medtech and digital health space. So we're doing 4 investments in medtech at the moment. One would be, and these would be impact. So one would be in the oncology space, one is kind of late stage cancer, and then one is in the cardiology space for the heart valve space. So we look obviously at the intrinsic ESG factors with every investment that we make. That isn't really impact because they're the qualities intrinsic within the companies, and they obviously have to be favourable. We're not going to invest in any companies that have sort of negative
doesn't have that big
ESG, but we're probably seeing more focus on the G than the E and S because we're not seeing an awful lot of opportunities on the E and S side of things. But, so, we're not an impact fund, but we are making some investments in that space.
And, tricky in terms of, Faye, I'll come to you on this one actually, companies, how do they measure, their impact? That kind of is still a bit of a problem for some companies. And can you give us examples maybe of how entrepreneurs have demonstrated their potential impact to investors? What metrics and kind of validation are required to back up their impact proposition currently?
Sure, Niamh. And I think to answer that question, let's have to set the stage a bit. We were talking about the UN SDGs. The UN SDGs was launched 5 years ago, actually. This is not a new thing. They've been around since 2016. It's basically a shared to-do list for the world, right? It's not a framework or a tool where you measure. It's just a shared to-do list. I think for companies, this is an area actually that's pretty tricky because really, there might be the shared language, but there's no one framework or tool that's been accepted, by capital markets to measure impact. We're getting there. We're going to make progress, I'd say, in the next decade. But if you go back and think about how, global GAAP was developed, our accounting standards after the crash 100 years ago, That took decades to develop, right? And then I think with risk as well, we didn't really start measuring risk and investment until 60s and 70s, right, with some oil issues. And then now there are umpteen ways to measure risk. I think we're now in the next iteration of the development of our capital markets, and it's going to be around measuring impact and on society and on the environment. But the reason why it's tricky is because how do you compare? You can compare a dollar to a dollar, right? But how do you compare, for example, the creation of 1 kilowatt of renewable energy to a portion of carbon that's been captured and then resold? The announcement last week around International Sustainable Standards Board has been created finally to consolidate, because everyone's a little confused. Everyone's a little bit in the clouds on this. But I think the main thing is for companies to try to keep it simple at the early stage. It's certainly harder to go backwards when you're later stage, but you can do it. And maybe zone in on those 3 to 5 impact KPIs that you can identify. If you are around carbon capture, great, but there could be some other ones that you could focus on. And do you have the ability and capacity to actually measure the impact? Because many funds have said to me, oh, we've made impact investments. And I say, well, what did the investments do? Well, they made money. And I say, well, that's fabulous. But how do you know it actually made a difference in that sector? And I think, Richard made an example of Silver Cloud, which is great. And I'm sure they could go back and see how many people were able to then access services who have mental health challenges, but they weren't set about to measure that. And I think what's really important here is it has to be measured to be material. You can't just say your company and your product and service is going to do something if you can't actually prove it down the line. And I think we're just in the early stage of developing those standards. I think B Corp is doing some really good work, but we're not there. And I think the key is get more money, capital focused on impact, and drive the need to measure, accept that it's not going to be perfect. But hopefully we'll get to a point where impact is on the balance sheet and we all have a pretty good way of measuring it so we can solve these massive problems, because we really don't have a choice. We only have one planet.
Yeah, and measuring that double bottom line. Niall, you obviously see some of the existing tools. As Faye said, there are some existing tools out there. There's the Global Impact Investment Rating Scheme, which, as we were saying, can be difficult and tricky for early stage company to implement, and that's something hopefully they'll be able to hone over time. They and the market as a whole. Is EI seeing frameworks to evaluate companies within their portfolio with respect to impact?
Yes, we are. So it's interesting when thinking about this topic, it occurred to me that Enterprise Ireland actually is one of the longest standing impact investors around. When you think of what we do, actually, we're not a VC, but we're an impact investor in terms of looking to impact on the creation of jobs, exports, and economic benefit that accrues from that. And when we look at how impact evolved for us in recent years, impact became some other things, like how can we impact on the number of female founders, women founders in business, and we set targets around that. So we, using our money to impact on that. And now we're seeing the further evolution of impact for us. All those things that have gone before, but also added to that now the whole ESG framework. And when we look at our recent seed and venture capital call, which thankfully I have to say went really well, and we'll see a significant amount of new seed, pre-seed and seed stage money in the market from early next year. But when we look at that, we use an evaluation matrix on all of the funds that pitched into the seed and venture capital call, and we are now looking at how do we. So that's looking at it from a fund of funds perspective, but we're now looking at obviously through the HBSU and the wider organisation. We're now looking at how we can use a similar evaluation matrix in terms of, as we take projects to investment committee, we'll be looking at actually trying to define specifically what the impact areas are. And we haven't nailed down the scoring mechanic on that because, as Faye says, this is hard.
It's true.
And but we will certainly be. Everyone on our investment committee, all of the senior leadership team at Enterprise Ireland, all of the key strategic stakeholders in the startup space here have a very, very close eye on the alignment of investment and the investment of public funds with the national policies with regards to climate and sustainability and all that goes around that.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, just to turn to you then, thinking with that in that frame of mind. Can you talk to me about the different ways in which impact crowdfunding platforms can collaborate with other investors, such as Enterprise Ireland, VCs, and angels for impact?
Well, we do, and we have done. We co-funded a company that just closed a short while ago, both with Richard's DBIC Ventures and which was an Enterprise Ireland client as well, which has just closed now. So our mechanism by which we can collaborate with them is there already, and we're very willing to do so. But also, it opens up that network that Niall was talking about a short while ago. That kind of with more investors in there, big or small, doesn't matter. You're still opening up that network that can go out and start promoting that business, start kind of getting into those networks so that that business can flourish and grow. And with that democratization of bringing more and more people into it, it certainly just makes a big difference to that impact, and hopefully that business will prosper because of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Richard, what key impact areas and themes are you seeing in your deal flow at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's mainly in healthcare. And I mean, I really couldn't agree more strongly with what Faye said there. I mean, a lot of people claim impact, but the most important thing is it has to be measurable, right?
Yeah.
So, like the area, going back to what I was saying before, healthcare is definitely the biggest area that we're seeing, from an impact point of view. And some of the things we actually look at, like there's a lot of fluff. You can't really claim something's having an impact unless it's really kind of can be measured tangibly. But I think in healthcare, even with the likes of Silver Cloud, there was kind of tangible. They didn't set out to be an impact company, but by what they did, they reduced waiting times and improved, lowered the cost of delivery of care. So, healthcare and digital health is by far the biggest sector we're seeing. Just with an aging population, people living longer with more chronic disease, it all comes down to health economics. What's the cost of delivery, the cost of the patient? What are the clinical outcomes? So healthcare is probably the area we're seeing the most, it definitely is the area we're seing most deal flow in. And
And Faye, I'll ask you the same question if I may. Would you say the same? Is it healthcare, or are you kind of looking more towards seeing more deal flow in terms of agriculture or?
Well, we focus across a range of different segments because I think that optimizes our best chance for success. Sorry if my connection's a little fuzzy here. So we would see definitely in the ag space, definitely things coming through, starting to see a little bit more in circular economy, but that feels a bit slower because there hasn't really been a carrot to work in that space as much as we would like. Within the health space, definitely there is, but for us, we don't really look probably at the same, maybe there's some overlap with Richard, but we're not looking at those that devices which would take tons of years of regulatory approval. So we're looking for kind of technologies that are a bit faster to get into the market. But would see some areas definitely within the aging population, wearables, and then also in fintech, accessible fintech. We see a bit of that. I know the UK often has more within the fintech space, but we do look there as well. You're seeing some really great innovations across the board, whether it's, again, reaching people with disability or I made an investment recently in a company that's removing bias in the way that fund allocators make their investments, which is really interesting, right? So you're going into a whole different level. And then also you're seeing companies that are providing ESG ranking systems and for big corporates. So that's an interesting space. And then, there's a bit in the mobility tech. And then lastly, I would like to see more, but I am seeing a little bit of in the aging population, or the silver tech, I think is what they're calling it. So we look at quite a range because we think it's a better way to optimize our chances for success. And I think if there are more, and thanks to Enterprise Ireland, if there are more incentives to innovate in this area, we'll probably see more deal flow across the board. But I just don't think there has been the carrot to innovate as an impact company yet in Ireland as much as we need to do. So here's hoping in 2 years, 3 years' time, when we have this conversation again, I'll have a much more colorful answer for you.
No, absolutely. That's fantastic. And we'll be closer to silver tech ourselves at that stage, Faye. Niall, before I come back to you, Niall, for our final wrap-up question, I would ask if there's any questions from the audience, please do send them on in. And I know we have one or two coming in, so hopefully we'll have time for them. Niall, how do entrepreneurs on the call today identify and develop those big opportunities that we've discussed here today that are going to require, a different way of thinking and support to deliver on these opportunities? And how can EI encourage this? And funders?
Well, firstly, it is a stated ambition of our strategy moving forward to commit an increased funding and increased support services to companies that are making an impact on a whole range of clearly defined areas. And what I would say is, as companies now look, I always feel when we're talking about startups and we're talking about scale-ups, okay? We always talk about what does the customer need and want out of this, right? Okay, so one has to look at the customer's ESG goals, right? Okay, and try to align with that. It's all very well building your own strategy around particular areas of impact, but I think the way you can maximize the value of that for yourself as a promoter for the company and to build a company of scale under this key strategic impact pillar is to make sure that you get completely aligned with the impact goals of your customers. If your customer can use what you're selling them to deliver for their message to their board and to their customer base about how they're making a difference, I think creating that alignment around your messaging, around your value proposition, can only lead to good things, because this is an area that's going to get hotter and hotter and hotter for all the right reasons.
So understand your customers' problems, work backwards from there.
Absolutely, yeah.
Richard, I'm going to come to you with this question. We have a question in from David. I want limited investment and mentoring to keep at least 85% control of the business, but this will slow my growth. Is it better to sell more to accelerate the business?
We come up against this quite a lot, actually. It's a great question. I mean, you do need capital at some point to accelerate, but you need to get the level of dilution right. I'm not sure what stage this company is at or this promoter, but I would say if you're at pre-seed stage, you wouldn't really want to be giving up much more than that level of control of your business, because you're going to be diluted through seed rounds and so forth. It really comes down to, we do want to see companies bootstrapping and being really efficient and being able to do a lot with very little and demonstrating that kind of resilience. So I would say, we do see some companies, we've actually had turned down investments because they've given away too much equity at pre-seed stage. So it's important just to talk to others that have raised at that stage and make sure you get the valuation correct if you are raising money and don't give away too much equity.
Yeah, because if you give away too much, then it disincentivizes. But your investors, good investors, are not going to want to see that either, right? They're not going to want to see...
No, but you do see it with some privates maybe. They're not deliberately setting out to kind of scupper the cap table, but inadvertently they've agreed terms which, to a VC would be like, we see cap tables where companies have given away 35, 40% of the business before they've actually raised a seed round. And we know the journey that most companies go on, they're going to get diluted down, so...
I think where it's more problematic, in this particular case, and look, all we've been told here is 85% is the magic number. But where we've seen that it's more problematic in terms of over dilution early, actually, is where you've got multiple founders, and it's very, very hard if you've got 2 or 3 founders, if they do give up that position too early. Now there are mechanics. And good investors, particularly Series A, B investors, will create the mechanics where founders maybe have got a little too washed out too early, because that's the last thing investors want to see, is founders being disincentivized by their diminishing position on the cap table. So there's plenty of tools, but those tools are not a reason to over dilute early. They're more a response and a solution to where it happens. But I think in the case of an individual owning all of the equity, I think getting hung up on whether you want to own 85 or 75% sometimes for me can become the driving force in the quantum of the raise, whereas actually the driving force should be is how much money do I need to execute to maximize the growth rate that I can achieve in terms of building the team, building the product, and kicking on as hard as I can. And I would say to certainly sole promoters, or where you still own 100% and you're thinking about how much you give up, don't get overly hung up on this, and don't get overly hung up on valuation, because ultimately it's about value creation happens in the future, not now. Yeah. And I think it's about having the right mix of capital in place.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but we will have lots of time with our panel. Each of us are going to a breakout room, so you'll be able to join us there. You'll be able to ask us lots of questions, so please feel free to do that. Until then, I am delighted to say thank you, Niall, Faye, Chris and Richard. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on here joining us today.